When somebody tries to give you a million compliments and you barely know them, that's a problem. That's very problematic. They don't know you. What is the agenda? If somebody insists on having a very brief courtship and little by little, you don't realize maybe at the time they're pushing other friendships or family relationships away. If someone puts you on a pedestal, trust that you are going to be shot down very quickly when the time is right.
Hello again, and welcome to today's episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me on this week's Learning and Adventure. As you heard in the intro, our guest today is author Lizbeth Meredith. Hello, Lizbeth. How are things going there in Tennessee?
They're going well, Melvin. Thank you so much for having me on the show. How are they going for you now in Texas?
Going pretty well, chillier than I like, but it's supposed to warm up today, so
You've probably done a lot of shoveling that you weren't planning on this winter.
No, I didn't do any shoveling.
Okay.
Yeah, when it snows, I stay inside.
Okay.
I just wait for nature to take its course.
Good for you.
Okay, so in every photo I've seen of you online, you have a great big smile. So, are you at a happy place in your life now?
Say mostly yes. Thank you. Mostly, I would say all of life, though, there's going to be the ups and downs. And I love to be positive, but life still, throws life at me.
All right. So, we're going to talk about your story as the listeners heard in the intro. So, I want to talk about your former husband, Gregorios, then we won't mention his name again. Do your daughters have any type of relationship with their dad now?
They do not. I did try to force them to have a relationship with him when they became young adults. I had tried to very sparingly help connect them when they were a little bit older and had counseling and all of that. And it didn't go well. But then once they were young adults, I said, here's a great and safe way to try to do this because he may have changed. He may have, who knows? But I grew up without a dad and I know how painful that is. That really blew up in my face, but it blew up in their faces more. And they asked me to please stay out of their affairs regarding their father. So at this moment, they don't, but one never knows. There's always hope in the future.
That's too bad. Your memoir is called Pieces of Me Rescuing My Kidnapped Daughters, and it's now a Lifetime television movie called Stolen by Their Father. Did you ever think you'd use your journalism degree to write about your own family drama?
You know, that's so interesting. You're a journalist. That is a different skill set. So I really did think I wanted to be a writer. And my life, even before my kids were kidnapped, was pretty interesting as far as a subject matter to write about. But I think journalism definitely did not prepare me to write my life story. When I was a little kid, I liked to write tragic poems in which I died and everyone felt sorry for how mean they were. And I think that's not so unlike children. Like, you're going to be sorry you were mean to me. But, later I really did think about writing. I just didn't know how hard it would be to not just live that life, but write about it. It takes a different skill set than I'd ever been trained for.
So, how did you eventually get around to putting pen to paper?
Well, it wasn't easy, Melvin. It wasn't easy at all. It took me 20 years, and I mean literally 20 years. So I thought at first I'd just write it as I lived it, and it read like this happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. Super boring and very long. So I went to a writer's conference, and the agent told me, wow, this is awful writing. And perhaps you could think about getting some help with this. So I listened and I joined a critique group. I took memoir writing classes online and sometimes workshops locally. I eventually hired a writing coach and editor, and it took a long time. And I'm so glad it did, because when I started writing my book, it was an angry young person. I was 30 at the time I started writing it, 30 or 31. It was an angry person, spiteful, aren't I the victim sort of book. And I grew up in the ensuing 20 years. I grew up a lot. But when you write about someone else's life, even writing about my former husband, even writing about my mother, things like that, you start to empathize with them somewhat if you really do a deep dive into their lives. So it helped. I'm glad I was old by the time it came out, because it was a much better read. And it had something to offer readers instead of just a way for me to vindicate myself.
I completely understand that sentiment. My second book, I wrote about my father's family history. And my dad came from an abusive background. And he decided he would break that cycle. And I dove sort of into the psyche of his dad, my grandfather, who I never met because he died about 20 years before I was born. But from everything I'd known about him, based on my father's stories and my relative stories, I sort of did a psychological analysis of him, and I found it much more sympathetic than I intended it to be. Not that he wasn't a monster, but there were factors that contributed to that were outside of his control. His response to it just was not the correct one.
I love that you had that opportunity to do that and you gave yourself that opportunity. It does help with empathy. It increases, I think, empathy and resilience to kind of unpack those stories, but also look at that other person's life and say, what factored into this? It depersonalizes, it doesn't excuse it, but
Right.
it depersonalizes it. And then we feel lighter.
Yes, absolutely. And it made my dad more of a hero to me than he already was, which I didn't even think was possible. So,
Love that.
so do you think it's ironic that your daughters were taken to Greece after you were taken to Alaska for the same reason?
Yes, I think it is more than ironic, and it really in fact, that is the whole reason it got made into a movie was that sort of double abduction thing. It's ironic, but, it's when you really think about it, it's kind of not. I was used to chaos, and as a small child, I said to myself, "Man, I am going to be a great mother." I always knew I wanted to be a mom, and I thought, "My kids will never, ever experience a divorce. And later, as I was getting older, they'll never experience a parental kidnapping. It's going to be a stable life. I'm going to do great by them. I'll show my family what how it could be done." And I didn't do any of the work that it would have taken to break those patterns. I just dove right into the first relationship that felt familiar and like home, which in hindsight should have been a red flag to run out screaming out of the room when I met my former husband. But so, I made things so much worse for my kids than I'd ever had it. And it wasn't, I don't blame myself for the abduction, but I do have responsibility for some of my choices. And it has impacted every day of their lives since. Even though my daughters are doing great now and they're grown women, it still has an impact.
All right. Can you tell us the details about your own story getting taken to Alaska?
Well, I can tell you what I know because remember, I was tiny. I was a little bitty kid. I came from a family of 5 other siblings that I knew of. There were many more, but I didn't know about that. And all I remember was being a little bitty girl in a house, or rather a trailer full of tow-headed blonde, sisters that were a good bit older than me. And really, they weren't that older than me. They were like 5 to 10 years older than myself. But I clearly had very dark hair and very dark eyes. And in the sunlight, my skin darkened very quickly. I did not feel like I fit in, but I grew up with sisters in this small trailer with a husband that really of my mom's that was not my father, but I was supposed to call him dad. And so I do remember feeling like I don't fit in. This is not where I should live. This is not my home. And I was little when I started feeling that kind of, I would say, kind of angry and self righteous way as a child. Like, I deserve better. And it was years before I realized that, yeah, this person really wasn't my father. I had taken his last name illegally, but he wasn't my father. This wasn't my hometown. And there were other siblings I knew nothing about who had lost their mother because my mom didn't want her sons. So when she took her daughter, she left boys behind and they never got a Christmas card, a birthday card. When they wrote her lots of letters, when they had a forwarding address, they were unreturned letters. When one got cancer, no comment from her. When they got married, divorced, nothing. One has since passed. It was hard on me, of course, and I'm the writer in the family so far. Maybe others will write later, but it was really hard on them. We as people don't think much of when dads leave their families. I mean, that's a sad thing. but we kind of shrug our shoulders and say, that's too bad. Very common story. When a mom rejects her kids, oh my goodness. And those boys have had a rough time reconciling that. So that is what I remember, was being a little kid in chaos and not loving that part of it. There were great parts to my childhood. It's not like it was all tragic, but then also later on realizing the life that I've learned, the name that I have grown up with, the state that I live in, these stories, these facts are not facts. They're not necessarily really my whole story. So I better learn more.
If you haven't thought about writing a second book, you need to seriously think about that. That's a whole nother story that you need to
Thank you.
delve into. I would highly recommend that.
Thank you.
So, and maybe that'll get made into another TV movie, Lifetime movie. So,
They're probably sick of me.
in your off time, you enjoy watching movies at the theaters, from what I understand.
Oh,
So,
I go to the movies so often. It is ridiculous. It's kind of terrifying. I think they want to get a restraining order against me. And they're like, you again?
Yeah, as long as you buy tickets, they don't care. So, what was it like seeing your own story and your own journey on this?
Well, that's a lot less fun, but I will say I loved the movie production company. They were not Lifetime, even though, Lifetime's wonderful. I worked with a Canadian production company for a couple of years, and I loved every one of them. And I appreciated, even during the pandemic, they were trying to include me from afar. And so, but I still, it's the same with reading my book. I've never listened to the audiobook of my memoir, never, because it just makes me so anxious. And so when the movie was coming out, I thought, I knew I might not like it as a film buff, that I might not like it. And how was I going to explain to people, like, how do you reconcile that? And you know what? When I finally saw it, I really did like it. They did a very nice job, very respectful job, not over sensationalized job. I like the choices they made for cast. And, it is weird, but I certainly don't watch it. I watched it the one time. And then another time when I was substitute teaching at a school one day, a teacher brought in a TV for all the students to watch the show together. Which was kind of funny and very odd because they were all under the age of 18. I was thinking, is this okay? Anyway, we did that. And that was also an out-of-body experience. But I think they did a good job. I really do. Just a very lovely job.
So, how did that movie change your life? Or did it change your life?
It might not have changed it in the ways that people think. There's so many things that I think people suppose that will happen to a writer, especially if your book is adapted to a movie. As a writer, that anymore, especially, books cost you money. I mean, when I publish a new book, which I did recently, that's thousands of dollars that I have just kissed goodbye, very likely. Even over the lifetime of the book, if I ever make that money back on what I paid the editor alone, that's going to be a miracle. So at least with a book to movie, there is some money that, although I split it with my publisher, but there is some money that comes in. So I think people often want to know about that, but it is not life-changing, but it was still wonderful. It's more than I would have had. But depends on the kind of book or movie that is launched. Mine was about tragedy and intergenerational family trauma, domestic violence, child abduction. So what it really did was green light to everyone who had similar issues, it felt like, to reach out to me on my website and have me solve their problems. And unfortunately, that's not a thing. I can't. I still work. I have to pay the bills. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to be able to do that for them. And so at first I started guiltily meeting with people by Zoom. And then I realized I can't keep up. I just can't. So that was a real weight for about 2 years. It was really heavy until I said to myself, you can't do that. You can have a stock answer or you can not respond. You can only do the best that you can, but you can't fix these things. So it was wonderful in some ways, it's very gratifying. I no longer put a lot of pressure on myself to achieve certain things because my book, it was exciting that it became a movie. So for subsequent books, I don't feel like I don't want to worry about that anymore. People ask, and it's a very fair question, like, does it change book sales? It may if you wrote a book and then the movie is titled the same, but in general, it was already selling pretty well for a nobody memoir. But I don't feed my cats with what I made on book royalties. That, I really don't. Like, I get very, very little to nothing for book royalties now. It's fine. It's just, I just don't want people to think in their heads when I talk to authors at conferences and things. It's important that we write for there are different ways to be wealthy. And so that we can develop a connection or inspire or help someone is a sign of wealth. But it might not be bank wealth. It might not be investment wealth. And writing what one loves to write about is important. I wouldn't write hoping that I could quit my day job if I didn't already have one. That's just my experience. But it certainly connected me with wonderful humans, fabulous people. And it's if I ever had something, I don't ever mention it when I meet people, but if I ever was lacking something to say, I could always say, my life is a Lifetime TV movie. Then they would automatically feel sorry for me because they know it had to be tragic.
Yes.
We just get some sympathy right there.
Yeah, no happy stories on Lifetime, from what I understand.
And the funny thing is, Melvin, people, and I don't mean it as a bad thing, but our human brain, we're wired to kind of love the negative. I have a lot of times writers think, oh, you must be an amazing writer that you had your first book become a TV movie. Not at all. I just had a really bad life and people love that stuff. So that's good. That worked for me.
What do you tell people who are themselves in a dark place in their life? You tell them to write a book?
No, I mean, it really does depend on, because sometimes writing a book, it's not always cathartic and therapeutic. It's really not. If a person has gone through a lot of tragedy, especially, and they've not processed it, if they haven't had group support or maybe a therapist or someone to talk to and work through those issues, journal, whatever, it can be a very bad idea. It can bring them to dark spaces that shouldn't be opened alone, you know? So I definitely don't recommend it for everyone, but I would say if I have to prop myself back up every winter, right around January, I think some dark thoughts. I have a very hard time with seasonal affective disorder, and I lived in Alaska for more than 50 years. So I still have to say to myself and to other people, this is a moment, and it's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and our lives are a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And, we don't write our early chapters of our life. We inherit them. We don't get to choose a lot of anything. We get to hopefully shape some of the middle and influence it as we get older, and we learn that we can't change what's happened to us, but we can definitely alter how we respond to it. And hopefully we come up with an ending that we're proud of. Doesn't mean the ending that we assumed. I do not believe, like modern pop psychology, you can manifest anything you like and we all have equal access to a joy, stress-free life. That's not true. But we can certainly impact the ending and appreciate our efforts and celebrate them. And the outcome isn't always what we wanted, but sometimes it's that journey to get to the goal that shapes us. And that's exciting about life.
Okay, you talked about, or you sort of referenced some of the red flags that you should have recognized. What are some of the ones that you can now see you've missed in your?
And I wish, I wrote in the book as a first person present tense, as though it was happening now. When I was a young person, if you'd asked me after I left my husband and I was in my mid 20s, I would have told you, hey, nobody told me. I didn't know. No, there were times that people had tried to tell me, and I must have had my fingers in my ears, not listening or looking at obvious signs. When somebody tries to give you a million compliments and you barely know them, that's a problem. That's very problematic. They don't know you. What is the agenda? If somebody insists on having a very brief courtship and little by little, you don't realize maybe at the time they're pushing other friendships or family relationships away. If someone puts you on a pedestal, trust that you are going to be shot down very quickly when the time is right. Tiny little jokes, little, haha, I was just kidding. Things like, you're so clumsy, or, you're not very smart, are you? Oh, I'm just kidding. Or those little bitty digs constantly may be signaling an insecurity in a new partner that later can become much bigger. A lot of times, young people, even today, because I still talk at colleges sometimes and with younger people groups, a lot of times we feel like it's so flattering to have someone who wants our constant attention. Sometimes we feel like making that commitment to them will help them feel more secure. I guarantee you it does not make them feel stronger and more secure. And it can be a red flag that worse things are yet to come. So I would definitely be cautious of some of those things. If someone attempts to isolate you, if they do not celebrate your own goals, if they're trying to keep you away from the things that you have identified are important to you, those are things to be cautious of. And I feel like as a young person, I see this a lot in the South. I'm new to the South in a way, even though I was born in Kentucky. Living here in the South now, I still see a lot of very young people getting married and having children super young. And I think our brains are not even fully developed until we're in our much later 20s. Some decisions so important. Can't we get to know ourselves first before we dive into those things that should have lifelong and do have lifelong consequences, whether or not they work out?
Right. So, how have you leveraged some of the difficult lessons you've learned in your journey to become your superpower?
Can you say that a little? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I was leaning backwards. How have you leveraged some of the difficult lessons you've learned in your journey to become your own superpower?
I think there are a few different ways. One is I took inventory of some of the things, skill sets that I learned going through this long period of being in an abusive relationship, leaving, only to find that things got much worse after leaving for several years until he took the kids and left the country. So eventually I kind of took stock of some of the things I had to learn during that time to successfully, with the help of a lot of people, reunite with my daughters. And some of those things really were small things like learning to create rapport with people in agencies in which I needed to access support from, whether it be the State Department, whether it be public assistance back when I was living in the shelter, whether it be child support or child protective services, even because before my kids were kidnapped, my former husband would call in reports constantly, anonymous reports to Child Protective Services, the very office that I went to work at later. But anyway, learning to make rapport with people, learning to develop community was really important. I was very afraid of getting into an airplane when I was young, very afraid. When my kids were kidnapped, I would have this reoccurring nightmare of a plane crashing. And it scared me so much. And yet I had to learn not only to get back on a plane, but to do it alone. And I was still young. I was still in my 20s when they were kidnapped. And so having conquered that fear because I had to, and learning to live in hostels and very cheap housing, I later learned as an adult, I thought, hey, my kids were grown. I still wasn't wealthy or anything like that, but I was fine. But I could travel. And that in itself helped develop less anxiety and increase resilience. I could travel. I traveled to Laos and Vietnam, and I went to Australia by myself. And I could do that on a budget like no other because I had learned to travel alone and maintain a budget, skip meals if I had to, whatever. I could do that. And so, there are things that I realized I'm not as fragile as I would think. I can do this. It doesn't mean I'll do it elegantly. It doesn't mean I won't get lost or lose my passport or something bad could still happen to me. But I have learned that I can land on my feet. And maybe someday I'll do something and I won't land on my feet, and that will be the end. That'll be okay. That'll be okay. I'd rather live life than stay under my bed and say, isn't it a scary, awful world out there? When I went to Greece, I had to go twice when my kids were kidnapped, but I learned to make friends with locals in Greece. Those friendships are still intact. They were amazing individuals that I met, but it takes a certain skill set I didn't have to land and learn to talk to people who didn't speak necessarily my language primarily. That still helped with travel later. And it's something that I just love and I appreciate. And I also learned that justice matters to me so much. And then working in the very system for 30 years after my kids came home in the very justice system that often failed me, helped me understand so much about why government can't be responsible for every human problem there is. It just helped me not be bitter and judgmental and weird. So I am very grateful for that as well. I did my best to affect justice as when I could, and sometimes I failed miserably and maybe became a part of somebody else's awful story, you know? But sometimes I was there for the great things too. I got to see people stand up and find their voices and move forward in a great way.
That's awesome. So sometimes people make excuses for their partner's abusive behavior based on their partner's rough background.
Right.
Is that some kind of trauma informed care in action that you've seen?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Melvin, because I have a whole talk that I have yet to give at a university because I used to be a trauma informed care trainer at my government work and probation. But that is the one time when I would tell people there are times when trauma informed care we should not be trying to rescue our partners. That's a project, not a partnership. And so I do feel like often women, sometimes men, absolutely sometimes men. And we know intimate partner violence can happen in straight and gay relationships, but often we are trying to fix the problems of those we love, not realizing, A, that doesn't work, and B, that's not our role. And it absolutely can be detrimental to a relationship and to the person who tries so desperately. I tried desperately to iron the wrinkles out of my husband's life. I didn't want to be a divorced person. I never remarried after that. I was like, okay, one and done. But if he was unhappily employed, I tried to find him a better job. If he said he didn't have the right schooling, I did my best to find whatever it was. Clearly, substance abuse was an issue for him. I tried to help, find help for that. He was never going to have me help him. And it certainly came at my detriment and my children's detriment. So I think we have to be very careful when teaching people about trauma informed care. It's important to look at a person and know that things may have happened to them that we would never wish on anyone. That doesn't mean that we hold people less accountable for their conduct. That should never be a free pass at all. And in fact, that doesn't help them. So, yeah, I think trauma informed care has an interesting conversation woven into it about intimate partner violence.
Okay, for the survivors of those
Yes.
types of traumas, do you always recommend that they write their stories?
No, that they write their stories. No, if they have not, if they have not processed those stories, if they have not gotten support, if they don't have distance from it, it can be very detrimental. Also, if they are still unsafe as a survivor, if they're not careful, they could be writing something that comes back to haunt them. It could be very dangerous. So I really don't. I would say it's an individual choice. I highly believe that it can be therapeutic. It can be a wonderful experience, all of that. But there's a lot of personal work to do before starting to write their stories. Journaling, sure, if that's a safe bet. But some people, if they're not living in their own home and they leave that out, or if they're still with their partner or their partner comes around, that could be detrimental as well.
Wow. So if somebody actually does follow through their process, their situation, they write a book and they want their books to become a movie, as happened with you, what surprised you about the process, and what advice would you give to people in that situation?
Well, and I would say just keeping in mind that most stories that do get optioned for movies are not made. So off the bat, if someone ever gets their story option, that is free money. It could be anywhere from $1, literally, to more. I was lucky that I got an option, some money, but it is not a guarantee that their story is going to be made into a movie. It's just somebody renting their story for a period of time. I learned that there are a lot of situations where a movie or a book is optioned to become a movie only because a similar movie is being made, and they want to make sure that this author doesn't option with someone else and provide competition at the same time. So it's literally tamping them down from telling their story. That's okay though, because most of us would take money if our book's already out. So that's something to consider. I would say one thing that helped my situation was I did have a really weird life. So that is something people like, very weird. But also, getting customer online book reviews was one of the most important ways that my book got noticed and someone reached out to me. And I know this because I asked. I said, "How did you hear about my independently published book?" I am a nobody. That's what an agent told me, and he wasn't being rude. But at a writer's conference, he said, "You're not Michelle Obama. You're not Mrs. Trump. You're not a Kardashian. This is a well-written story, and nobody cares. So it's going to be really hard for you to sell any books." And he was not wrong at all. It is really hard to sell books anymore. But getting people to review, getting a book worthy of being reviewed, but then getting people to review one's book, that helped. The person who found my book said she did a search inside of Amazon. And Amazon, even if people don't like Amazon, even if they don't have their own books on Amazon or won't buy through them, we have to admit it is one of the largest search engines for books. And what do people do when they are thinking about buying a product? They look at the reviews. They may not buy it from a big retailer like an online retailer, but they still look at the reviews. So she said she did a word search with a couple of keywords and my book came up. So that does matter. I think people should know that there's limited input that they can have once they sign an option, because once you sign, it's kind of like working with a publisher. And even if you don't work with the publisher, once you publish your book, it's no longer yours, it's the reader's. And they read it from their lens. They don't read it the way you necessarily wanted them to. And so a book is only a sliver, a memoir is a sliver of life, and a movie is a smaller sliver. So keeping that in mind, I'm lucky because I had wonderful humans who were on the other end of my production team. But I've talked to other writers who've said, I accidentally signed away not just my rights to my story, but future writings, because I didn't consult with a cinema attorney. They don't need a literary agent. They need a cinema attorney. Or they wrote this so far different than my real story is, and it's now an embarrassment to me. So that's important to know. I am very fortunate because I did have things in place, and I had reached out as soon as I heard that it might even become a contract. I started reaching out to writers whose stories had been adapted. And sometimes they've signed a non-disclosure agreement, but after a certain while, they're willing to break it. And I would never name them, but they helped so much to say, watch out for this, watch out for that. Just because it's a movie doesn't mean book sales will go up. Just because it's a movie doesn't mean that you will have it named the way that you hoped or whatever. That's fine. And just know that if it's a tragic story and it comes to fruition, people will write thinking you can help solve their problems, which are so sad and so heavy, but it may not have this feeling that we all hope for when our books become a movie. So, there was a long period of time where I just thought, what have I done? And this is wonderful and I'm grateful. And yet it can still be really hard.
Wow. So I've seen online that you've written that promoting your book borrowed some of the same skill set you used to rescue your kidnapped daughters. Can you elaborate on that?
My second book, I did a lot of book events, like book groups and things like that. After my memoir was published, I got a grant so I could travel the country and go to some different states even. And people would ask the same questions over and over at events, like, how do you get through it? What skill set did you need? All of that. Well, I'd worked for years at that point in the justice system where I didn't just have my experiences, but amazing skill sets that clients had shown me. So I wrote my second book about that so that then when people ask those questions, I could I could say, hey, this is available. And I try to keep my books so that they could be rented in libraries. So they could always request them at a library if they couldn't afford it, So Grounded in Grit, Turn Your Challenges into Superpowers is a sum total of that. And then the third book is a novel that was published recently, and the audiobook's coming out this next month. And that one's just much more fun, much more lighthearted. And I needed to talk about something but tragedy. And, but it is good for all of us, we go through hard times. None of us are going to be exempt from that in life. But if we can mine those times and see the people that stood up for us, or the skills that we learned, the things that we wouldn't do again, or the things that even were funny, no matter what happens in life, I worked with crime victims for a long period of time. They could even sometimes tell you funny stories that happened at a funeral, even though the event itself was so incredibly tragic. But those are all things of resilience. And I do believe no matter how we share our stories, whether we're talking to one another in a support group or on a podcast or writing, that is something that can increase resilience and reduce, kind of unpack some of our trauma. We'll never get over it, but we can learn to incorporate it.
This question is very personal for you. Has time healed all the wounds that you suffered over the years?
Never, never, never. And so time, I think that is such it's an unfortunate phrase. Time heals all wounds. Sometimes we cry less, that is for sure. And sometimes people, and I've worked with people who will say, like, this will sound really awful, but like, my child was murdered by someone 5 years ago, and I've never spoken about it because I just don't want to draw the memories back. It lives inside you. Trauma can live inside of us. And there are some great books, not the least of which is Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. That book is The Body Keeps the Score. The body does keep the score. And it lives inside of us. I had a sibling, my oldest sister, who was committed to never sharing family secrets or traumas. And she would get so annoyed if any of us went to counseling. And she'd say to me, how could you do this? How could you talk about that stuff? Why would you bring that up? Dredge that up, she would say, on her 5th drink at noon. And life was short for her. Trauma can cut your life short because of so many different things. So definitely time does not heal all wounds. And even though I've gone to a ton of therapy, still have a therapist that I see sometimes, always will. I have no shame about that. Talk and write about trauma. There are still things that, won't ever be they're not erased. Let's put it that way. They live with me, and we live for the most part well together, but it's not going anywhere.
Okay, so the last question I've got for you today. Can you tell my audience about your podcast and the topics that you address on your own show?
Absolutely. I began Persistence, as in the letter U, PersistenceU with Lizbeth. During the pandemic, part of it was I knew I was retiring from government work, but also, and I would be alone during the pandemic, I thought about our future generations, how they would never know what it was like to live in a supportive world like I had when my kids were kidnapped. There were people from across the globe who had nothing to gain, who stood in to help. Instead of saying, oh, post it on Facebook and there's a GoFundMe and stuff. No, people got personally invested. And so I started PersistenceU about trauma, resilience, and frankly, the power of persistence. And I love to share stories, not just of like, oh, something bad happened to this person. Sometimes nothing bad did happen to them, but stories that really share someone's unique perspective and how their life changed. There was a before, and then there was an after, and the skills that they learned in the middle. So that is PersistenceU with Lizbeth. It comes on twice a month, where people get their podcasts. And it's been such a joy to meet people podcasting.
It absolutely, I can agree with that. It absolutely is a joy to meet people, hear their stories, learn from their lessons. It's just an incredible experience for me, and I'm sure it has been for you. And I've listened to a couple of episodes of your podcast, and I plan to listen to more. So
thank you.
I've enjoyed it. Our guest today has been author and survivor, Lizbeth Meredith. Lizbeth, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your stories with my audience.
Melvin, I loved every bit of it. Thank you for having me. I so appreciate your time.
Thank you. So if you don't already follow me on Spotify or some other podcast platform, I would appreciate it if you would do that now. And then please share this episode with a friend who you think could benefit from Lizbeth's story. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other's stories and journeys. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.